She was condemned to freeze in the unforgiving Rockies. A widow traded to a mountain savage as punishment for a crime she didn't commit. But the wealthy family made one fatal miscalculation. The beast they sent her to die with was the only man capable of teaching her to live. The mahogany doors of the Montgomery estate slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot in the grand foyer. Abigail stood shivering in the center of the Persian rug, her black mourning dress clinging to her frail frame. It had been barely 2 weeks since her husband, Arthur Montgomery, had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine in the Wind River Range, a bullet lodged cleanly between his shoulder blades. Before her sat her father-in-law, Judge Cornelius Montgomery, a man whose wealth was only eclipsed by his cruelty. In the Cheyenne territory of 1,882, the judge owned the banks, the lawmen, and the timber operations. He sat behind his massive oak desk, steepling his fingers, his eyes cold and unyielding as they bored into Abigail. "You brought a curse into this house, Abigail," the judge's voice rumbled, devoid of any paternal warmth. "Arthur was my heir. He was supposed to bring this family glory. Instead, he dies in the dirt like a common drifter, clutching a satchel of our family's money that has mysteriously vanished." "I had nothing to do with Arthur's debts, Judge," Abigail said, her voice trembling but her chin held high. "You know as well as I do that Arthur spent his nights at the faro tables and his days drinking." "Silence," Cornelius roared, slamming a heavy fist onto the desk. "He is dead, and you are alive." The town whispers. "They say you hired a cutthroat to do away with him to inherit his portion of the estate. I will not have the Montgomery name dragged through the mud and tried in a public courtroom for a woman as insignificant as you." He leaned forward, the flickering gaslight casting demonic shadows across his weathered face. "There will be no trial. You are guilty in the eyes of this family, but I am a merciful man. I will not hang you. Instead, you will be escorted to the high timberline. There is a trapper up there, Caleb Hayes. The town calls him a savage, a man who traded his humanity for the wilderness. I have paid him a handsome sum to take you in as his property. A lifetime of servitude in the frozen peaks. If you try to run, the mountain will kill you. If you stay, he will." Abigail's breath hitched. She had heard the stories of Caleb Hayes. Men who went into his woods looking to log his timber never returned. He was an outcast, a giant of a man who lived outside the law. To be given to him was a death sentence disguised as exile. By dawn, Abigail was loaded onto the back of a freight wagon driven by a sour-faced teamster named Jebediah. She possessed nothing but the clothes on her back and a small leather trunk containing 2 wool dresses and her mother's Bible. For 3 days, the wagon lurched higher into the brutal, jagged teeth of the mountains. The air grew perilously thin, and the late autumn winds sliced through her thin wool coat like a razor. When the wagon finally ground to a halt at the edge of a dense, impassable pine forest, the sky was bruised with the threat of an early blizzard. "End of the line, widow," Jebediah spat, tossing her small trunk into the snowbank. He pointed a thick, gloved finger up a narrow, barely visible goat path winding into the dark timber. "Hayes's claim is 3 miles up that ridge. Better start walking before the freeze sets in." Without another word, the teamster cracked his whip, leaving Abigail entirely alone in the suffocating silence of the wilderness. Panic threatened to swallow her, but survival instinct took over. Abigail hoisted the heavy trunk by its leather strap and began to climb. The snow was already calf-deep and falling faster, thick white flakes blinding her vision. Every step was an agony of burning lungs and numb extremities. Hours bled into one another. The world became nothing but a howling vortex of white and gray. Her legs finally gave out. She collapsed against the frozen trunk of a massive spruce, her chest heaving, her vision going black at the edges. "This is it," she thought, the bitter cold lulling her into a dangerous, sleepy warmth. This is how Cornelius intended for it to end. Just as she closed her eyes, a massive shadow detached itself from the blizzard. Through her fading consciousness, Abigail saw a figure that looked more bear than man. Broad-shouldered, draped in thick furs, with a wild, dark beard framing piercing, pale eyes. He stood over her, an axe resting casually on his shoulder. Abigail couldn't even scream. The darkness rushed up to meet her, and the last thing she felt was a pair of massive, calloused hands effortlessly lifting her out of the snow. Warmth. It was the first thing that registered in Abigail's mind. A deep, radiating warmth accompanied by the sharp, earthy scent of wood smoke, pine needles, and roasting meat. She opened her eyes, her vision swimming before focusing on the rough-hewn log ceiling above her. She was lying on a sturdy cot, buried under layers of heavy, incredibly soft wolf and bear pelts. Her frozen morning dress had been removed, replaced by a massive, oversized flannel shirt that smelled of cedar. Panic instantly seized her. She bolted upright, pulling the heavy furs to her chin, her eyes darting around the room. It was a one-room cabin, but immaculately kept. Cast-iron pans hung in neat rows above a roaring stone fireplace. A heavy oak table sat in the center, and a repeating rifle leaned against the doorframe. Sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of birchwood with a hunting knife, was the man from the blizzard, Caleb Hayes. He stopped his carving and looked at her. Up close, he was intimidating. A rugged, hardened face weathered by years of sun and wind, a thick, dark beard, and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, sharp, and intensely observant. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jawline, adding to the terrifying legend that surrounded him. "You're awake." His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Drink the tea on the barrel beside you. Pine needle and willow bark. It'll stop the shivering." Abigail's hands shook as she reached for the tin cup. You changed my clothes." Caleb didn't look up from his knife. "Your dress was frozen solid. If I left it on you, you would have lost toes to frostbite, maybe your life. I didn't look, if that's what you're worried about. I've got no interest in a half-dead city woman." His bluntness was startling, but there was no malice in it, just cold pragmatism. Abigail took a sip of the bitter tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "Judge Montgomery sent me," she whispered, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. "He said he paid you." Caleb finally looked up, his pale eyes locking onto hers. He set the knife down. "Cornelius Montgomery sent a rider up here a week ago with a pouch of gold. Said he was sending me a worker to help keep my cabin. Said you were a criminal who needed breaking." He stood up, towering over the room, and walked to a small wooden chest at the foot of his bed. "I took the gold because winter is long, and I need the supplies. But I don't break horses, and I certainly don't break women." Abigail watched him warily. "Then what are you going to do with me?" "You'll heal," Caleb said, tossing a pair of thick woolen socks onto the bed. "You'll help with the chores to earn your keep. Cooking, mending. Come, spring thaw. When the passes are clear, I'll take you down to the rail station in Laramie. You can buy a ticket anywhere you want. Until then, we stay out of each other's way." Over the next 3 weeks, a silent rhythm developed in the cabin. The blizzard raged outside, completely burying the trails and isolating them from the rest of the world. Abigail, terrified of being a burden and inviting the wrath of the savage, worked tirelessly. She learned to cook venison and rabbit over the open hearth, mended Caleb's heavy canvas gear, and swept the floor until it was spotless. Caleb, true to his word, kept his distance. He spent his days checking trap lines, chopping cordwood, and smoking meat. He spoke rarely, but Abigail began to notice things. She noticed how he always left the choicest cuts of meat on her tin plate. She noticed how he placed extra logs on the fire before he went to sleep so she wouldn't wake up cold. She noticed that the hands rumored to have killed a dozen men were incredibly gentle when they coaxed a wounded barn owl back to health on their porch. The fear that had paralyzed her began to thaw, replaced by a quiet curiosity. One evening, while Abigail was washing dishes in a basin of hot water, a glass jar slipped from her wet hands and shattered on the floorboards. She gasped, dropping to her knees to scramble for the shards. Caleb turned from the fire. "Leave it. You'll cut yourself." "I'm sorry," Abigail babbled rapidly, her breathing hitching. The instinct born of 3 years of marriage to Arthur Montgomery flared up. Whenever she broke something, Arthur's fists had inevitably followed. "I'm so sorry. I'll clean it. Please don't." She reached too quickly for a jagged piece of glass and sliced deep into the palm of her hand. She let out a sharp cry. In a second, Caleb was kneeling beside her. He took her bleeding hand in his massive paws. His grip was firm but impossibly careful. He didn't yell. He didn't raise a hand. Instead, he reached for a clean rag on the table and pressed it to the wound. As he held her hand, the oversized sleeve of her flannel shirt slid up her forearm. Caleb's eyes caught on the fading, mottled purple bruises that still ringed her upper arm, souvenirs from Arthur's final drunken rage before he rode up into the mountains. Caleb's jaw tightened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Abigail tried to pull her arm away, shame burning her cheeks. "It doesn't matter. He's dead now." "Your husband?" Caleb asked. Abigail nodded, looking at the floor. Arthur Montgomery." Caleb froze. The rag in his hand went still. He stared at her, his pale eyes widening a fraction before narrowing into a hard, unforgiving squint. "Arthur Montgomery was your husband?" "Yes," Abigail said, suddenly fearful of the dark shift in his demeanor. "Why?" Caleb stood up slowly, leaving her kneeling on the floor. He walked over to the stone fireplace, reached his hand into a hollowed-out alcove behind a loose rock, and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound satchel and a tarnished silver money clip. He walked back and dropped them on the oak table. Abigail's heart stopped. Embossed on the leather satchel was the gold crest of the Montgomery Bank. The silver money clip bore the initials A.M. "I didn't know his last name until now," Caleb said, his voice heavy with a truth that was about to shatter Abigail's world. "About 3 weeks ago, a man rode up my trail. He was drunk, belligerent, and holding a repeating rifle. He told me he owed some very bad men in Denver a lot of money, and he knew I had a hidden vein of gold on my property." Abigail stared at the satchel, her mind racing. "The judge said Arthur was murdered, shot in the back." "He was shot," Caleb said flatly. "By me, but not in the back." Caleb unbuttoned the top of his Henley shirt, revealing a nasty, freshly healed bullet wound just below his collarbone. "He fired first, unprovoked. The moment I stepped out of my cabin, I fired back to defend my own life. He stumbled back, fell over the ridge, and broke his neck in the ravine. I took his satchel to figure out who he was, but there was no identification, just the bank crest and that money clip." Abigail was trembling, not from cold, but from the massive tectonic shift of reality. Her husband hadn't been murdered by bandits. He had tried to rob and kill the very man standing in front of her. And Judge Cornelius, knowing full well the kind of degenerate his son was, had sent Abigail up here to die, effectively burying the only person who could ask questions about Arthur's missing debts. Caleb looked down at the fading bruises on Abigail's arm, then back to her eyes. The rugged mountain man's gaze softened, a profound understanding passing between them. "Your father-in-law didn't send you here to be broken, Abigail," Caleb said softly. "He sent you to the man who killed your husband, hoping I was the monster the town says I am. He sent you here to be buried in the snow." Abigail looked from the silver clip to the giant, scarred man who had fed her, clothed her, and protected her. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of the Montgomery name lifted from her chest. "He made a mistake," Abigail whispered, a fierce spark of survival igniting in her eyes. "He sent me to the only safe place I've ever known." The deep freeze of January and February locked the Wind River Range in an impenetrable vault of ice. Inside the cabin, however, a slow and profound thaw was taking place. The revelation of Arthur's true fate and the judge's sinister plot had shattered the remaining walls between Abigail and Caleb. Stripped of the Montgomery family's oppressive shadow, Abigail began to find pieces of herself she thought had died years ago. She stopped jumping at sudden noises. The color returned to her cheeks, driven by hearty venison stews and the crisp, clean mountain air. Caleb, too, was changing. The gruff, solitary mountain man who had intended to completely ignore her found himself looking forward to the evenings. He would sit by the fire, mending traps, while Abigail read aloud from her mother's Bible or the few worn dime novels Caleb kept on a shelf. He found himself mesmerized by the cadence of her voice, the gentle way she moved about the cabin, and the fierce, quiet strength that had allowed her to survive the judge's cruelty. One crisp morning, Caleb handed her a heavy Winchester repeater. "The mountain doesn't care if you're a man or a woman," Caleb said, leading her out to a snowbank where he had lined up several pine cones on a fallen log. "It only cares if you're prepared. Tuck the stock tight against your shoulder. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it." Abigail's first shot went wildly into the timber, the kickback knocking her into the snow. She expected him to laugh or scold her, the way Arthur would have. Instead, Caleb offered his massive, calloused hand, pulled her up, and patiently corrected her stance. By the end of February, she could hit a pine cone from 50 yards away. "Why are you out here, Caleb?" Abigail asked him one night as the wind howled against the log walls. "The town treats you like a monster, but you're a good man. The best I've ever known." Caleb stopped whittling. He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his pale eyes. "I used to be a deputy marshal down in Cheyenne. I saw how men like Cornelius Montgomery ran things. They bought the law, stole land from homesteaders, and hung anyone who stood in their way. I refused to play their game. When I started digging into Montgomery's bank ledgers, my house mysteriously caught fire in the dead of night." He touched the jagged scar on his jaw. Barely made it out. "They told the town I went mad and burned it down myself. I realized the only way to stay clean was to leave the dirt behind." Abigail reached across the table, her fingers gently brushing against his thick, scarred knuckles. It was the first time she had initiated contact. Caleb went incredibly still, his eyes snapping to hers. "They were wrong," Abigail whispered. "You didn't run away. You just found higher ground." Caleb turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. The touch was electric, a silent vow forged in the heart of the wilderness. They didn't need words. The bond between them was absolute. But the mountain could only protect them for so long. In late April, the spring thaw finally began to break the ice-choked passes. The snow melted into rushing, muddy rivers, and the trails became passable once more. It was during this time that a French-Canadian fur trapper named Jacques stumbled upon their claim. He had come seeking shelter from a sudden spring downpour. Caleb, adhering to the unspoken code of the mountains, offered him a hot meal and a place by the fire. Jacques was a man of loose lips and heavy drinking. His eyes widened when he saw Abigail clean, healthy, and moving with a confident grace around the cabin. He knew the rumors of the Montgomery widow who had supposedly perished in the winter storms. 3 days later, Jacques was sitting in a saloon in Cheyenne, trading his beaver pelts for whiskey and a story. He drunkenly boasted to the bartender about the beautiful ghost living with the savage up on the ridge. The bartender told the sheriff, and the sheriff went straight to Judge Cornelius Montgomery. In the mahogany-paneled study of the Montgomery estate, Cornelius's face flushed with a violent, terrifying rage. His plan had failed. Not only was the widow alive, but she was living with the one man who could connect Arthur's death to the missing bank funds. Cornelius unlocked his desk drawer and pulled out a stack of gold eagles. He summoned a man named Hollis Reed, a ruthless, dead-eyed bounty hunter known for leaving no witnesses. "Take 5 of your best men," Cornelius ordered, sliding the heavy pouch of gold across the desk. "Ride up to Hayes's claim. I want the cabin burned to the foundation. I want the savage dead. And I want the widow's head brought back in a sack. Leave nothing but ashes." The morning the riders came, the forest was deathly quiet. Caleb was out back, splitting firewood, when the ravens suddenly took flight from the southern ridge, a massive black cloud squawking in alarm. A moment later, his trained ear caught the unnatural snap of a dry branch under a heavy boot, followed by the faint jingle of a spur. He dropped the axe and sprinted into the cabin, barring the heavy oak door behind him. "Abigail, get down!" Caleb barked. She didn't ask questions. She dropped the cast-iron skillet she was washing and dove behind the thick oak table. Caleb tossed her the Winchester and a box of cartridges. He grabbed his own Sharps rifle and took a position by the front window, peering through a small crack in the shutters. 6 men on horseback were fanning out across the clearing, their dusters blowing in the spring wind. Hollis Reed sat in the center, a lit cigar clamped between his teeth and a double-barreled shotgun resting on his saddle horn. "Hayes," Hollis's voice echoed across the clearing. "Judge Montgomery sends his regards. We're here for the woman and the satchel. Send her out, and we'll make your end quick." Caleb looked back at Abigail. She was terrified, her hands shaking, but her jaw was set with a fierce determination. She levered a round into the chamber of the Winchester. She wasn't the victim anymore. "Tell the judge to come get her himself," Caleb roared back. Gunfire erupted. A hail of lead shredded the front of the cabin, shattering the windows and sending shards of glass and splintered wood flying across the room. Caleb fired back, the heavy boom of the Sharps rifle dropping one of the riders instantly. Hollis signaled his men to dismount and surround the cabin. The battle devolved into a grueling siege. Bullets tore through the thinner sections of the logs, forcing Caleb and Abigail to stay low. "They're going to try and burn us out," Caleb yelled over the deafening cracks of gunfire. "I have to flank them. Keep them pinned down from the window." Before Abigail could protest, Caleb slipped out the heavy back door, vanishing into the dense brush like a ghost. Abigail was left alone in the smoke-filled cabin. She crept to the window, resting the barrel of her rifle on the sill. She saw a man creeping toward the porch with a lit torch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She remembered Caleb's voice. "Tuck the stock tight. Squeeze it." She fired. The man screamed, dropping the torch into a puddle of mud as he clutched his shoulder and retreated behind a tree. Suddenly, a series of rapid gunshots echoed from the tree line. Caleb had flanked them. He moved with the deadly precision of a cornered predator, his rifle dropping 2 more of Hollis's men in quick succession. The mountain was his domain, and they were trespassing. Panic set in among the surviving thugs. One tried to flee on horseback, but Caleb shot the reins from his hands, sending the horse rearing and dumping the man into the dirt. Hollis Reed, realizing his men were being slaughtered by a phantom in the woods, made a desperate, suicidal dash for the cabin door, shotgun raised. He kicked the door open, aiming wildly into the room. He didn't see Abigail standing in the shadows by the fireplace. She fired the Winchester. The bullet caught Hollis in the kneecap. He howled in agony, collapsing onto the floorboards, his shotgun clattering harmlessly away. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by Hollis's groans and the wind rustling through the pines. Caleb emerged from the tree line, his rifle smoking, his chest heaving. He walked into the cabin and looked down at the bleeding bounty hunter. "Please," Hollis begged, spitting blood. "Montgomery paid us. It was just a job." Caleb knelt beside him. "You're going back to Cheyenne, Hollis. But you're not taking the widow." Caleb walked to the hidden alcove and retrieved Arthur's leather satchel. He had spent the winter examining its contents. It didn't just hold money. It held Arthur's personal ledgers. The books detailed exactly how Cornelius Montgomery had been embezzling federal funds from his own bank to cover his son's gambling debts, pinning the blame on local homesteaders to seize their land. Caleb tossed the satchel onto Hollis's chest. "You ride back into town and hand that straight to the federal marshal. You tell him Judge Montgomery hired you to murder an innocent woman to cover up his federal crimes. If you do that, the marshal might let you live in a cell. If you don't, I will come down this mountain, and I will find you." Hollis nodded frantically, terrified of the giant looming over him. Later that week, the town of Cheyenne awoke to a spectacle. Federal marshals surrounded the Montgomery estate. Judge Cornelius Montgomery, stripped of his dignity and his power, was dragged out in iron shackles, screaming threats that no one listened to anymore. The empire built on cruelty and corruption crumbled in a single afternoon. High up on the ridge, far away from the noise and the dust of the town, Abigail stepped out onto the porch of the cabin. The spring air was sweet with the scent of blooming columbines. She watched Caleb walking up from the creek, a string of fresh trout in his hand. He looked up, his pale eyes catching hers, and a rare, genuine smile broke across his scarred face. Abigail had been sent to the mountain to freeze, a discarded pawn in a rich man's deadly game. But the wilderness had burned away her past, leaving only steel behind. She walked down the steps to meet him, taking the fish from his hand and wrapping her arms around his waist. He rested his chin on the top of her head, pulling her tight against his chest. They didn't need the town, and they didn't need the wealth. They had the mountain, the sky, and a love forged in the fires of survival. The widowed woman hadn't just survived her punishment. She had claimed her absolute freedom. If you were captivated by Abigail and Caleb's harrowing journey of survival, justice, and untamed romance in the Wild West, please hit that like button to let us know. Share this story with your friends who love thrilling historical dramas. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more epic tales of love, betrayal, and redemption. Leave a comment below with your favorite moment.
Hi, my name is